In 1930, the New Yorker hotel opened with 2,503 rooms, 95 switchboard operators, and a private power plant buried 80 feet below the sidewalk that could light a city of 35,000 people. Guests paid $3.30 a night and never once wondered where the electricity came from. But beneath every grand American hotel, beneath the marble and the crystal and the uniformed doormen, there was a second city. A city of boilers and laundries and bread ovens and workers who were never meant to be seen. This is the story of the people who lived below the floor and what happened when they refused to stay hidden. Chapter 1. The Palace That Needed a Factory Underneath. In 1893, a hotel opened on Fifth Avenue with 970 servants and only 40 guests to serve. The hotel was the Waldorf, and the ratio was not a mistake. It was a philosophy. William Waldorf-Astoria had spent $11 million building a palace for people who already lived in palaces, and George Bolt, the man hired to run it, understood a truth that would define American luxury for the next 7 decades. Comfort at this level could not be improvised. It had to be manufactured, and the factory had to be permanent. Bolt refused to dismiss a single employee, even as that catastrophic ratio of servants to guests threatened to bankrupt the operation in its first summer. His logic was not sentimental, it was industrial. A grand hotel was not a house with extra bedrooms. It was a machine. The kitchen had to be ready to serve a banquet for 1,000 on 3 hours' notice. The laundry had to press 10,000 napkins, whether 10 guests or 1,000 were in residence. The boilers had to run at full capacity because the pipes would freeze if they did not. Every system inside the building demanded continuous operation, and continuous operation demanded a permanent workforce, standing ready at all hours, regardless of how many rooms were occupied. This was not the logic of hospitality. It was the logic of heavy industry, and Bolt embraced it completely. What he built beneath the Waldorf set the template for everything that followed. 42 feet below the Fifth Avenue sidewalk, in rooms no guest would ever see, he installed the largest isolated electrical generation system in the world. Not the largest in New York, the largest anywhere. A hotel on a fashionable street corner was generating more electricity than most American towns. The basement held its own refrigeration plant, capable of manufacturing 150 tons of ice every single day. It held a pumping station with the capacity to supply water to a city of 400,000 people. It held kitchens large enough to prepare 5,000 meals in a single service, and a laundry that processed thousands of pounds of linen every morning before the first guest rang for coffee. The engineering department alone employed dozens of men who worked in rotating shifts, monitoring gauges and adjusting valves in rooms where daylight never reached. This was not excess. This was math. In 1893, there was no reliable municipal electricity on the scale the Waldorf required. There was no commercial laundry in Manhattan equipped to handle the volume. There was no ice delivery service that could guarantee 150 tons daily. If you wanted to operate at this level of luxury, you had to build the infrastructure yourself. And if you were building it yourself, you had to bury it. Because the entire premise of a grand hotel was that effort should be invisible. The guest should experience only the result, never the cause. The Waldorf opened during a severe economic depression. Banks were failing across the country. Unemployment was surging toward levels that would not be matched until the 1930s. And on Fifth Avenue, a hotel was running a private power plant for 40 guests. The dissonance was the point. Luxury does not merely ignore economic reality. It defies it. The Waldorf's basement was a declaration that comfort at this scale existed in a separate world from the one outside, a world with its own electricity, its own water, its own ice, its own laws of supply and demand. George Bolt understood something else, something that would define the industry for generations. The servants were not a cost to be minimized. They were the product. 970 people working in silence below the floor and along hidden corridors were what made the Waldorf different from every other hotel in the city. Their invisibility was not an accident of architecture. It was the architecture's entire purpose. Every hallway had two versions, one for guests, lined with silk and mahogany, and one for staff, lined with bare plaster and lit by gas. Every staircase had a twin. Every elevator had a shadow. The building was designed so that a waiter carrying a silver tray could travel from the basement kitchen to the 14th floor without crossing a single guest corridor. The guest could walk from the lobby to the dining room, to the ballroom, to the bedroom, and never once see the engine that powered each experience. This was the founding innovation, not the chandelier in the lobby or the marble in the bathroom. The innovation was the system of concealment that made everything else possible. And it worked so well that it became the standard. Within a decade, every ambitious hotelier in America was copying Bolt's model, building bigger basements, hiring larger staffs, and burying more machinery beneath more marble. They did not know it yet, but they were building a system that contained, in its very foundations, the terms of its own collapse. The workers who made it run would eventually demand to be seen, and the technology that made it necessary would eventually make it obsolete. But in 1893, all of that was decades away. The motors hummed, the ice machines churned, 970 servants moved through hidden corridors, and 40 guests sat in a dining room the size of a cathedral, believing that comfort simply happened. The next question was inevitable. If one hotel could do this, what would happen when someone tried to do it bigger? Chapter 2: The Men Who Bet Fortunes on Basements. Potter Palmer once secured the largest personal bank loan in American history to rebuild a hotel that had burned 13 days after opening. The year was 1871. The Great Chicago Fire had destroyed the original Palmer House, a wedding gift Palmer had built for his wife, Bertha. The building had been open less than 2 weeks. Palmer did not hesitate. He borrowed $1,700,000, an amount so large that the bank's board debated whether any single individual should be trusted with it, and began construction on a replacement that would be fireproof, permanent, and grander than anything Chicago had ever seen. This was the mentality that built the underground hotel cities. These were not cautious men. They were gamblers who bet everything on a single conviction: that Americans would pay for luxury if the luxury was spectacular enough to justify the price. Palmer's rebuild cost the modern equivalent of roughly $40 million, and he poured a significant share of that money into what no one would ever see. The boiler rooms, the laundry, the kitchen, the engineering plant, the basement infrastructure that would keep the visible palace functioning above. Bertha Palmer, his wife, understood the public side of this equation with equal ferocity. For the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, she was appointed president of the Board of Lady Managers, one of the most powerful social positions in the country. She commissioned the Palmer House pastry chef to create a portable dessert for the ladies of the fair. The chef produced a small, dense cake layered with apricot glaze and walnuts. It was, by most credible accounts, the first brownie. Millions of fairgoers ate it. None of them knew it had been invented in a basement kitchen beneath a hotel lobby by a worker whose name was never recorded in the society pages that breathlessly covered Bertha's every outfit. The pattern held, the glory rose to the surface, the labor sank below. The brownie traveled upward from a basement kitchen into the light of the World's Fair. The cook who made it remained in the dark. Palmer's gamble paid spectacularly. The rebuilt Palmer House became the social center of Chicago, its lobby ceiling adorned with a fresco later described as a protest of romance against the everydayness of life. That fresco looked down on guests who never saw the basement beneath their feet, the basement that was pure everydayness, coal, grease, steam, and the sound of motors running without pause. The success convinced a generation of developers that the formula was sound. Build big, build underneath, hide the machinery, charge accordingly. The Stevens family took that lesson and multiplied it beyond anything Palmer could have imagined. Ernest Stevens made his fortune in the Illinois Life Insurance Company and decided to build the largest hotel in the world. The Stevens Hotel, which opened in 1927 on Michigan Avenue overlooking Grant Park, was a monument to scale in every dimension. 3,000 rooms, 2,500 bathrooms, an 18-hole miniature golf course, a bowling alley, a hospital with a full surgical suite, staffed by doctors and nurses available around the clock, a barber shop with 24 chairs, a rooftop that could host events for thousands, and beneath it all, a basement complex that dwarfed even the Waldorfs. 20 million cubic feet of enclosed space, much of it below grade. The hotel had its own candy factory, churning out chocolates and confections served to guests as though they had arrived from a fashionable shop. It had its own ice cream plant, its own print shop producing menus and stationery and event programs. It employed a permanent staff that numbered in the thousands and maintained a physical plant comparable to a small manufacturing district. The Stevens family poured $15 million into the project. That figure represented more than construction costs. It represented a family's entire identity fused to a building. Ernest Stevens did not merely build the hotel, he became the hotel. His reputation, his fortune, his social standing, all of it was mortared into the walls and welded to the pipes and wired into the switchboard of the world's largest hotel. And the hotel became, in time, the instrument of the family's destruction. But that chapter of the story comes later. In 1927, the Stevens was a triumph. The industry press called it the eighth wonder of the world. Competitors in New York looked at the numbers and did what competitors always do. They built bigger. The New Yorker Hotel, designed by the architectural firm of Sugarman and Berger, opened in 1930 with 2,503 rooms and a power plant that was, in engineering terms, a genuine marvel. The plant ran on coal, later converted to oil, and generated enough electricity to power a small city. Its switchboard was 60 feet long. Its refrigeration system could produce hundreds of tons of ice daily. The hotel even built a private tunnel decorated in Art Deco tile, connecting its basement to Pennsylvania Station, so guests could walk from train to room without ever stepping outside or encountering the city between them. By 1930, the model had reached peak confidence. Every major new hotel was larger, more self-sufficient, and more deeply committed to the basement concept than the last. The financial logic seemed unassailable. Vertical integration was cheaper than outsourcing. A captive workforce was cheaper than contractors. And guests, who never saw any of it, were willing to pay premium rates for the seamless experience the hidden machinery produced. The industry had built itself into a position that looked, from the lobby level, like permanent prosperity. From the basement level, it looked like something else entirely. The infrastructure required constant feeding. Coal by the trainload, water by the millions of gallons, workers by the thousands, and all of it sustained by a single assumption: that demand would remain high enough to justify the cost of running a private industrial city 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without interruption. No one in 1930 was asking what would happen if the demand disappeared. They were about to find out. Chapter 3: Cities Within Cities, Built to be Forgotten. The Stevens Hotel enclosed 20 million cubic feet of space, including a hospital, a candy factory, and an 18-hole golf course, and the guests above never saw the machinery that made any of it possible. The genius of the Grand Hotel was not its luxury. Any building could install a crystal chandelier. The genius was the architecture of disappearance. Every Grand Hotel built between 1880 and 1930 contained in effect 2 buildings occupying the same footprint, one visible, designed to enchant, and one hidden, designed to produce everything the visible building consumed. The visible building was the subject of postcards and press coverage. The hidden building was the subject of nothing. The hidden building was a masterwork of logistics. Consider the problem facing the architect of the Waldorf-Astoria, the combined version that opened in 1897 after the Astoria wing joined the original Waldorf. The kitchen prepared thousands of meals each day. Each meal required ingredients stored in basement cold rooms, cooked in basement kitchens, plated by basement staff, and delivered to dining rooms on upper floors. Not a single kitchen worker could appear in a guest corridor. Not a tray, not a cart, not a wisp of steam could escape into the world the guest inhabited. The solution was an elaborate system of dumbwaiters, service elevators, and parallel corridors that effectively doubled the building's circulation. The Waldorf had one set of hallways for guests, wide and carpeted and decorated with paintings, and a second set for staff, narrow and unfinished, and hidden behind service doors that were designed to be invisible from the guest side. A waiter could carry a covered dish from the sub-basement to a private dining room on the 15th floor and encounter nothing but other staff members the entire way. The guest, seated at a white tablecloth, saw only the finished product arriving through a door that appeared to lead nowhere. This dual architecture was expensive. It roughly doubled the cost of the building's interior circulation, adding thousands of square feet of space that generated no revenue and served no aesthetic purpose. The hotels paid that cost willingly because the dual system was not a luxury. It was the product. Without it, the guest would see workers. And a guest who saw workers would begin to calculate the true cost of comfort, a calculation the hotel could not afford. The Plaza Hotel refined this principle with its coal delivery system. The building consumed enormous quantities of coal to fuel its boilers, and coal delivery was, by nature, a filthy business involving heavy carts, thick dust, and physical labor that was entirely incompatible with the image of elegance the hotel projected. Horse-drawn carts and later trucks dumped tons of coal into chutes hidden in the sidewalk on the hotel's service side. These chutes, covered with iron plates when not in use, fed directly into basement bunkers where stokers shoveled fuel into furnaces around the clock. The coal arrived through one world and was consumed in another. Today, remnants of those coal chutes remain visible in the plaza's lower levels, alongside original subway tile that once lined the passageways where workers hauled fuel and ash without ever entering the public spaces above. The New Yorker added an innovation that was equal parts engineering and theater. Its Art Deco tunnel to Pennsylvania Station was not merely functional, it was beautiful, lined with the same decorative tile work that adorned the lobby because it served a dual purpose. Guests used it to arrive without facing the weather, but the tunnel also functioned as a service artery, allowing supplies to move between the station and the hotel's basement without ever crossing a public street. The hotel could receive shipments from across the country, unloaded from freight cars at Penn Station, and have them in the basement kitchen within minutes, all beneath street level, all invisible. The tunnel was, in miniature, the Grand Hotel's philosophy made concrete, a passageway that served both luxury and labor, but never let them meet. The scale of what these basements contained defies casual imagination. Consider the numbers from multiple hotels, stacked together to convey the cumulative reality. The original Waldorf generated enough electricity for a town of thousands and produced 150 tons of ice daily. The Stevens Hotel had its own hospital with a surgical suite, its own candy factory, its own barber shop with 24 chairs, its own print shop, and its own ice cream plant. The New Yorker's power plant was so large and so sophisticated that the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers would later designate it a milestone in electrical engineering, placing it alongside the Niagara Falls hydroelectric facility in the history of American power generation. The Palmer House maintained a lobby ceiling fresco that one writer called a protest of romance against the everydayness of life, painted above a basement that was pure everydayness. Coal dust, steam, grease, and the sound of motors running in permanent darkness. Combined, these hotels employed tens of thousands of workers below grade, consumed trainloads of coal weekly, and operated around the clock 365 days a year. Each hotel was a closed system. It generated its own power. It manufactured its own ice. It baked its own bread. It laundered its own sheets. It butchered its own meat. It printed its own menus. Some had their own carpentry shops, their own upholstery workshops, their own florists raising flowers in basement greenhouses under artificial light. The Grand Hotel did not rely on the city around it. The Grand Hotel was a city, compressed vertically, with the pleasant neighborhoods on top and the industrial district buried below. And it all depended on one thing, that the people working in the industrial district would remain there, silent, hidden, content to operate the machinery that made other people's comfort possible, for wages that barely covered their own survival. Act 1 ends here, at the peak of ambition. The system is built, the basements are humming, the guests are satisfied, the workers are invisible. The next chapter goes beneath the floor, and it stays there. Chapter 4, 80 feet below the lobby, 200 motors in the dark. The engineers called it the Frankenstein board, a 60-foot switchboard controlling every light, every ice machine, every vacuum cleaner in a 42-story building. This is what existed beneath the New Yorker Hotel, and what, in variation, existed beneath every grand hotel in America. Begin at sidewalk level and descend. The lobby is 42 stories above you. Below your feet, the building continues downward for another 80 feet, a depth equivalent to an 8-story building buried underground. The air changes. The temperature rises. The sound shifts from the muffled hum of a lobby to the deep, mechanical throb of heavy machinery. In those 80 feet lived an industrial complex that rivaled any factory in New York City. The power plant occupied the deepest levels. It ran originally on coal, delivered through underground tunnels, and stored in massive bunkers that had to be continuously replenished. The coal arrived by the ton, moved by workers who shoveled it from storage into furnaces that burned around the clock. Later, the plant converted to oil, but the scale of the infrastructure remained. Massive boilers heated water into steam at pressures that could kill a man if a valve failed. Steam drove turbines. Turbines spun generators. Generators produced electricity. The plant's total capacity was sufficient to provide power for a city of 35,000 people, every watt of it consumed by a single building that rose above the plant like a monument to its own appetite. The Frankenstein board managed this enormous output. Its name was not official, but every engineer in the building used it because the thing looked alive. 60 feet of switches, dials, gauges, and circuit breakers stretched across one wall of a room that existed in permanent semi-darkness, lit by the glow of indicator lamps and the occasional bare bulb. Engineers worked in rotating shifts around the clock. They monitored every circuit in the building, every light in every guest room, every motor in every elevator, every compressor in every refrigerator, every pump in every bathroom, every exhaust fan in every kitchen. The switchboard controlled it all, and the engineers who operated it understood the building the way a surgeon understands a body, as a system of interconnected functions where a failure in one part could cascade through the whole. A tripped breaker on the wrong circuit could darken an entire guest floor. A failed pump could stop water service to hundreds of rooms. The Frankenstein board was the building's nervous system, and the men who watched it never left it unattended. Beyond the power plant, the basement contained the refrigeration system. In an era before reliable commercial refrigeration, the Grand Hotel made its own cold. The Waldorf system produced 150 tons of ice daily. The New Yorker's was comparable in scale. Massive compressors running on ammonia coolant that was toxic if it leaked. Chilled brine solutions that circulated through pipes to cold storage rooms, kitchens, and guest floor pantries. The sound was enormous, a constant low-frequency hum that vibrated through the lower floors and could be felt, if not heard, in the lobby above. Workers in the refrigeration rooms wore heavy clothing despite the summer heat outside, because the temperatures near the compressors fluctuated wildly between the scorching heat of the motors and the freezing cold of the output. The laundry operation alone would have qualified as a major industrial facility in any city in America. A hotel of 2,000 rooms generated a staggering volume of soiled linen every single day. Thousands of sheets, thousands of pillowcases, thousands of towels, thousands of napkins, thousands of tablecloths, thousands of staff uniforms. All of it cycled through basement laundry facilities that ran from before dawn until after midnight. Industrial washing machines the size of automobiles agitated loads so heavy they had to be lifted by mechanical hoists. Mangles, massive heated rollers, pressed sheets flat at temperatures that could blister skin on contact. Ironing stations ran in rows where workers stood for 10 and 12-hour shifts in steam so thick they could barely see the person beside them. The air was saturated with moisture, with the smell of soap and bleach, and with the heat of equipment that never cooled down. The laundry was, by every measure, a factory. It operated under factory conditions: loud, hot, wet, relentless, and largely invisible to anyone who did not work there. Kitchens occupied another vast section of the underground. The main kitchen of a hotel like the Waldorf or the Stevens was not a room. It was a complex of interconnected rooms, each dedicated to a specific function. a butcher shop where animal carcasses arrived whole and left as cutlets, steaks, and roasts, a bakery producing hundreds of loaves and thousands of rolls before sunrise, a pastry section where cakes, tarts, and delicacies were assembled for banquets, a garde-manger for cold preparations and salads, a hotline for live service during meal hours, separate preparation areas for banquets, room service, and staff meals. Walk-in coolers the size of apartments held meat, fish, dairy, and produce in quantities measured by the ton. The Stevens Hotel maintained a candy factory, producing chocolates and sweets, and an ice cream plant, churning out frozen desserts that were served to guests as though they had materialized from a confectioner's shop, rather than from a factory floor 60 feet below their dining table. The pumping plant deserves its own attention. The original Waldorf's water system had the capacity to supply a population of 400,000. That figure sounds impossible until you consider the demand. Thousands of guest bathrooms drawing hot and cold water simultaneously. Hundreds of kitchen faucets running continuously during service hours. Industrial laundry machines consuming thousands of gallons per cycle. Boilers requiring continuous water feed to produce steam. Fire suppression systems pressurized and ready on every floor. Cooling towers on the roof fed by pumps in the basement. A single Grand Hotel used more water in a day than many American towns used in a week, and every drop of it had to be pushed upward against gravity by pumps that ran without stopping. Here is the scale, stacked and stated plainly, because the numbers deserve to be heard together. The New Yorker's power plant generated enough electricity for 35,000 people. The Waldorf's refrigeration system produced 150 tons of ice every single day. The pumping system supplied water sufficient for a city of 400,000. The Stevens Hotel enclosed 20 million cubic feet of space below the public floors. The New Yorker's switchboard stretched 60 feet across a wall in permanent semi-darkness. The Palmer House consumed coal by the rail car, burning it continuously to keep the steam and heat flowing upward. The Plaza's boilers ran around the clock, 365 days a year, because the pipes would freeze and burst if they stopped for even a few hours in winter. Across Manhattan and Chicago, beneath the feet of guests who ordered champagne and danced to orchestras and slept on Egyptian cotton, an industrial army operated machinery that would not have been out of place in a steel mill or a municipal power station. The IEEE plaque on the New Yorker's wall tells you everything you need to know about the scale of what was accomplished in these basements. The Institute recognized the hotel's power plant as a milestone in electrical engineering, an honor reserved for installations of historic significance to the field. The other installations on that list include the Niagara Falls hydroelectric facility. A hotel basement stands in the same historical category as the most famous hydroelectric dam on Earth. That is not a metaphor. It is a fact, etched on a plaque, hanging on a wall, in a building where most occupants have never been to the basement, and none of the guests knew. That was the entire point. The architecture of the Grand Hotel was designed to ensure absolute separation between the world of comfort and the world of production. The Frankenstein board hummed. The 200 motors turned. The ice machines churned. The laundry steamed. The kitchens roared. And 80 feet above, a guest rang a bell and a meal appeared, carried through a door that seemed to lead nowhere, delivered by a hand that seemed to belong to no one, as if the entire experience had been conjured by magic. But there was no magic. There were people, thousands of them, working in heat and steam and noise and darkness around the clock for wages that would not cover a single night in the rooms they serviced. Their story is the one the architecture was designed to erase. Chapter 5: 83 cents a day and no right to eat. In 1912, a New York hotel waiter worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and paid his own supervisor for the privilege of being fed. The system had a name for this arrangement. It was called the tipping system, and it functioned as a mechanism for transferring the cost of labor from the hotel to the guest, and from the guest to the worker, and from the worker back to the hotel in the form of kickbacks and fees. A waiter in a grand hotel received no salary, or a salary so small, perhaps a few dollars a week, that it was effectively decorative. His income came from tips. But to secure a station in a profitable dining room, he first had to pay the headwaiter a portion of his expected earnings. To eat a meal during his 12-hour shift, he had to pay the cook. To store his clothes in a locker in the basement, he had to pay a fee to the hotel. The money flowed upward and outward, and the waiter, who appeared in the dining room wearing a pressed uniform and a professional smile, was often taking home less than $1 a day after his obligations were met. The system was not an oversight, it was a design. Hotels discovered early that by shifting the cost of wages to the customer through tips, they could reduce their payroll to nearly nothing while maintaining a workforce that appeared, to the guest, to be well compensated and content. The waiter's smile was not optional. It was a condition of employment. A waiter who did not smile did not receive tips. A waiter who did not receive tips could not pay the headwaiter. A waiter who could not pay the headwaiter lost his station. The entire structure was a machine for producing the appearance of willing service while extracting the maximum possible labor at the minimum possible cost. The New York World investigation of 1912 laid these conditions bare with the force of an indictment. Reporters documented the lives of hotel workers in detail that remains disturbing more than a century later. Chambermaids were assigned 30 rooms each, to be cleaned across 11-hour shifts with no scheduled break for lunch. They carried their own supplies up and down the service stairs. They worked alone, in rooms where they were forbidden to sit on the furniture or use the bathroom facilities. They were, in the language of the investigators, treated as interchangeable parts in a machine designed for someone else's comfort. The kitchen workers had it worse. Below the gleaming dining rooms where guests lingered over meals that cost more than a worker's weekly wage, cooks, dishwashers, and prep workers labored in basement kitchens where ventilation was poor and temperatures regularly climbed above 100 degrees in summer. Grease fires were a routine hazard. Burns were constant. The floors were slick with water and food waste. These were conditions that would have prompted an inspection and likely a closure order in any factory covered by the emerging labor laws of the progressive era. But hotels were not factories. Hotels were service establishments, and service workers existed in a legal gray area that left them largely unprotected by the statutes that were beginning to shield industrial workers from the worst forms of exploitation. The workers who maintained the mechanical plants occupied the deepest and most dangerous part of the hierarchy. The engineers and stokers and electricians worked at the bottom of the basement, operating equipment that could kill them. Boiler explosions were a known hazard in the early 20th century. The pressure vessels were not always well maintained, and the margin for error was thin. Electrical burns were common in the era before modern insulation and safety standards. Ammonia leaks from refrigeration systems could be, and occasionally were, fatal. The work was hot, loud, physically punishing, and performed in near total isolation from the world above. These men could work an entire career in a hotel basement and never once enter the lobby they were keeping lit and warm. And yet the most revealing detail was not the danger or the exhaustion or the poverty wages. It was the deliberate concealment. Hotel architects designed staff circulation systems specifically to ensure that guests never saw the people who served them except in controlled, costumed encounters. A waiter at a table was visible. A waiter carrying dirty dishes through a service corridor was not. A maid turning down a bed was visible, briefly. A maid carrying soiled linens down a back staircase was not. The system treated uncontrolled visibility as contamination, a breach in the product. A worker seen in a guest corridor without purpose was a failure of design, and a failure that could lead to dismissal. This concealment was not merely aesthetic, it was economic. An invisible worker is a worker who cannot be understood as a worker. Guests who never saw the laundry, who never saw the boiler room, who never heard the sound of 200 motors turning in the dark, who never smelled the steam of the ironing stations or the grease of the kitchen, could sustain the belief that their comfort was natural, effortless. Certainly not the product of someone else's 12-hour day in a windowless room below the sidewalk. And as long as the guests held that belief, they would not question the price. They would not wonder whether the people producing their comfort were being paid enough to eat without bribing a cook. On May 7, 1912, the people in the basement answered that question for them. Workers at the Belmont Hotel walked off the job. Within days, the strike spread to 54 hotels across New York City. Busboys, waiters, cooks, chambermaids, dishwashers, porters, and laundry workers left their stations and appeared on the sidewalk, in daylight, carrying signs. For the first time, the guests could see them, not in uniform, performing service with a practiced smile, but in street clothes, on a picket line, demanding to be treated as human beings. Their demands read today as a catalog of basic dignity. 1 day off per week, a 10-hour working day instead of 12, sanitary lockers in which to store their clothing, the right to eat a meal during a shift without paying a bribe to the kitchen, the right to know, in advance, what they would be paid. The hotel's response was swift, coordinated, and brutal. Managers hired replacement workers within hours. Police were called to disperse picket lines. The press, with a few notable exceptions, sided with ownership, framing the strike as an inconvenience to guests rather than a response to documented exploitation. Within weeks, the strike collapsed. The most militant workers were blacklisted from every hotel in the city. Those who returned to work did so under the same conditions they had left, at the same wages, on the same 12-hour shifts, with the same requirement to bribe the headwaiter and pay the cook for a meal. The strike of 1912 failed by every immediate measure. Wages did not rise, hours did not shorten, conditions did not improve. But the strike accomplished something that the architecture of the Grand Hotel was specifically designed to prevent. It made the workers visible. For a brief period, the guests of 54 hotels could see, on the sidewalks outside their windows, the people who had been hidden beneath them. The system of concealment had cracked. It would take decades to widen, but the crack was there, and it would never fully close. The basement had spoken. And the men who owned the basements spent the next 26 years making sure it would not speak again. Chapter 6. The invisible workforce refuses to disappear. It took 26 years, 4 failed strikes, and the passage of a federal law before hotel workers won the right to a signed contract. 26 years. From the first walkout at the Belmont in 1912 to the recognition of the Hotel Trades Council in 1938, more than a quarter century passed, during which hotel workers organized, struck, were defeated, reorganized, struck again, were defeated again, and came back again. The persistence itself tells you everything about the conditions they were enduring. People do not spend a generation fighting for a signed contract unless the alternative is unbearable. The industrial workers of the world, the IWW, played a critical early role in organizing hotel workers. Their language was explicit. They did not talk about wages in the polite euphemisms of the American Federation of Labor Trade Unions. They talked about servility. They talked about dehumanization. They said, plainly and publicly, that the Grand Hotel operated on a system of human subordination that was incompatible with dignity. A worker who could not eat without bribing a cook, who could not store his clothing without paying a fee, who could not walk through the building's front door or use its public elevator, who was required to enter and exit through service entrances as though his presence in the visible world would soil it, was not an employee in any meaningful sense. He was a servant in the feudal meaning of the word, and the IWW intended to end it. They did not end it. The IWW was broken by federal prosecution during and after the First World War, by internal division over ideology, and by the ferocious opposition of an industry that understood exactly what was at stake. If workers became visible, if they organized, if they won legal protections and collective bargaining power, the entire economic model of the Grand Hotel would have to change. The math was simple and terrifying for the owners. Every dollar added to basement wages eroded the cost advantage of vertical integration. Every hour removed from a worker's shift meant hiring additional workers to cover the gap. Every regulation imposed on working conditions, whether ventilation standards or sanitary lockers or meal breaks, meant spending money on things the basement had never provided, money that came directly from the profit margin that made the system viable. The hotel owners understood this math perfectly. That is why they fought so hard and so long against every attempt at organization. It is also why they eventually lost. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, known commonly as the Wagner Act, changed the fundamental terms of the conflict. For the first time, federal law guaranteed American workers the right to organize and bargain collectively without retaliation from their employers. The hotel industry resisted. They argued, as they had always argued, that hotel work was fundamentally different from industrial labor, that it was personal service, not factory production, that the tipping system was not exploitation, but a cherished tradition benefiting all parties, that the workers were, despite all evidence to the contrary, content with their situation. The workers disagreed. Empowered by federal protections that made blacklisting illegal and required employers to negotiate in good faith, hotel workers in New York City organized with renewed force. In 1938, the Hotel Trades Council was formally recognized as the collective bargaining agent for hotel workers in the city. In 1939, they signed their first union contract. The contract was modest by later standards, but it established a principle that the hotel industry had resisted with every tool at its disposal for nearly 3 decades. That the people who worked in the basement were workers, not servants, not interchangeable parts. Workers with legal rights, enforceable agreements, scheduled hours, guaranteed wages, and a collective voice that could not be silenced by firing the loudest individuals. The signed contract was, in its way, more revolutionary than the strikes that preceded it, A strike was temporary. A contract was permanent. A strike made workers visible for days or weeks. A contract made them visible forever. The timing was devastating for the hotel business model. The Depression had already gutted occupancy across the industry. The massive basements, designed to serve thousands of guests at full capacity, were running enormous industrial plants at a fraction of their designed load. Every fixed cost was magnified, and now, at the worst possible moment, the cost of basement labor was rising as union contracts established minimum wages, maximum hours, and working conditions that added expense to every department below the lobby floor. Outside the hotel walls, a parallel transformation was underway. Commercial laundries were growing from small neighborhood operations into industrial enterprises capable of handling enormous volumes. Municipal electric grids were becoming reliable enough that a hotel no longer needed its own generator. Ice could be purchased from commercial suppliers at a cost per ton that undercut in-house production. Bread could be ordered from bakeries. Meat could be purchased already butchered. Every service that the hotel had once performed internally, every function that had justified the existence of the underground city, was becoming available from an external provider at a competitive or lower price. The economics that had built the basements were reversing. Vertical integration had been cheaper than outsourcing when labor was cheap, when municipal services were unreliable, and when demand was high enough to justify running a private industrial city at full capacity. Now labor was organized and increasingly expensive. Municipal services were expanding and increasingly reliable, and demand had collapsed. The underground city had been built on a foundation of cheap, invisible labor. The labor was becoming expensive, and it had already refused to remain invisible. Act 2 ends at the point of no return. The forces that will kill the basement model are all in motion. The Depression has emptied the rooms. The unions have raised the wages. Technology has created alternatives. And outside the city, a new kind of traveler is discovering a new kind of accommodation. The motel, a horizontal building on a highway, with no basement, no hidden workforce, and no pretense that comfort requires an invisible industrial city beneath the floor. The question is no longer whether the system will survive. The question is how fast it will fall. Chapter 7. 3,000 rooms and nobody in them. The Stevens Hotel opened as the largest in the world, went bankrupt, and was sold to the United States Army for use as barracks. The story of the Stevens family is the story of the basement model compressed into a single dynasty, a parable in brick and steel about what happens when ambition outgrows the system designed to sustain it. Ernest Stevens poured his insurance fortune into the largest hotel in the world. His family's name was carved into the facade. Their reputation was welded to its infrastructure, and then the building consumed them. The Stevens opened in 1927 to genuine wonder, 3,000 rooms, a basement complex that functioned as a self-contained industrial district with its own candy factory, its own ice cream plant, its own hospital, its own printing press. The lobbies gleamed. The press called the building the eighth wonder of the world. For 2 years, occupancy ran high enough to justify the enormous fixed costs of maintaining the underground city beneath the public floors. Every motor turned with purpose. Every boiler earned its coal. Then the Depression hit. The stock market crash of October 1929 did not merely reduce demand for luxury hotel rooms. It annihilated it. Occupancy rates, which had been running above 70% at the major urban hotels, fell by half or more. Business travel evaporated. Convention bookings disappeared. Wealthy families who had once kept standing reservations at the finest hotels began cutting expenses. The Stevens, designed for 3,000 guests on a good night, found itself with 300, sometimes fewer. But the basement could not operate at 10% capacity. This was the fatal flaw in the model. The boilers had to run whether the hotel was full or empty, because the steam heating system served the entire building, and shutting it down in winter would freeze the pipes and cause millions of dollars in damage. The pumps had to run because the water supply served fire suppression on every floor. The electrical plant had to run because the elevators, the lights, the refrigeration, and the ventilation required power around the clock. The laundry had to run at reduced volume because even 300 guests generated linens that needed washing. A hotel's infrastructure does not scale down gracefully. The costs were fixed, engineered into the building's bones, and the revenue had vanished. Every grand hotel in America was running the same terrible calculation. The basement cost roughly the same whether the hotel was full or empty. Coal still had to be purchased. Water still had to be pumped. Electricity still had to be generated. Workers, though many were dismissed, still had to be paid because the machinery still had to be operated. The fixed cost of the underground city, which had been an advantage when occupancy was high because it was cheaper than buying services externally, became an anchor dragging the entire enterprise toward insolvency when occupancy collapsed. The Stevens family experienced this dynamic in its most extreme and devastating form. The hotel went into receivership. Ernest Stevens watched the building that bore his name pass into the hands of creditors. The family's connection to the hotel became a story of loss that unfolded over years. Financial ruin, legal battles, the weight of the world's largest hotel pressing down on a family that had staked not just their money, but their identity on its success. The Stevens name, once synonymous with ambition and grandeur, became associated with the most spectacular hotel failure in American history. The New Yorker faced the same crisis, although its ownership was more diversified and its collapse less personal. The hotel had opened in 1930 to 800 reservations on its first night, a spectacular debut that suggested the investment would pay for itself in years rather than decades. But the debut was the peak. In the months and years that followed, the building's 2,500 rooms were largely empty, while 80 feet below the lobby, the Frankenstein board continued humming, and the power plant continued burning fuel to generate electricity that lit empty corridors and heated unoccupied rooms. The Art Deco tunnel to Penn Station, that gleaming corridor of decorative tile, carried fewer guests each month. The switchboard operators, who had once numbered 95, were reduced to a fraction. The basement staff was cut department by department. The ice cream plant fell silent. The candy factory closed. Here is the scale of the collapse in numbers. The Stevens Hotel carried a construction debt of $15 million, generating interest that consumed whatever operating income the reduced occupancy produced. The New Yorker opened into a market that was losing hotel guests by the thousands weekly as the Depression deepened through 1931 and 32. Across the country, an estimated 85% of American hotels were operating at a loss by 1933. Dozens went bankrupt. Hundreds were foreclosed. The basements that had been the engines of self-sufficiency became engines of self-destruction, consuming fuel and labor and capital to maintain industrial plants that were producing for buildings that were functionally empty. The Stevens Hotel was eventually sold to the United States Army during the Second World War. The Army used it as barracks, housing soldiers in its 3,000 rooms, conducting training in its ballrooms, and ignoring its basement entirely. The world's largest hotel, the culmination of decades of ambition and millions of dollars of investment, was reduced to military housing. There is a precision to the humiliation. A building designed to make wealthy guests feel like royalty was repurposed to house enlisted men in transit. The candy factory made nothing. The hospital treated no guests. The miniature golf course gathered dust. When the war ended, the building was sold to Conrad Hilton, who immediately began reducing its scope. The 3,000 rooms were cut roughly in half. The basement infrastructure was stripped, simplified, and contracted. The self-contained industrial city that Ernest Stevens had built was dismantled piece by piece, its machinery carted off, its rooms converted to storage, its workforce dismissed. Hilton understood something the Stevens family had learned at too great a cost. The model was broken. Scale was no longer an advantage. It was a liability. The lesson was clear. The basement model had been destroyed not by a single blow, but by the simultaneous failure of every assumption on which it had been built. High occupancy was the first assumption to fall. Cheap labor was the second. And the third, the assumption that no external provider could match what the hotel produced internally, was about to fall as well. Chapter 8. The machines that made themselves obsolete. By 1950, a commercial laundry could wash a hotel's sheets faster and cheaper than the hotel's own basement ever could. The paradox of the Grand Hotel basement was that its very existence had helped create the industries that would replace it. The demand for industrial laundry equipment, driven in part by hotels, had spurred manufacturers to develop machines that were faster, more efficient, and cheaper to operate than anything a single hotel could justify purchasing. The demand for reliable commercial electricity, driven by buildings like the New Yorker, had pushed utilities to build grids robust enough that private generation became unnecessary. The demand for industrial refrigeration had created a commercial cold chain that could deliver ice and cold storage at a per-unit cost that no hotel plant could match. The basement had seeded the industries that would kill it. The transition happened in stages, and each stage was quiet. There were no announcements, no press conferences, no farewell ceremonies. Each stage represented another engine going silent, another crew dismissed, another room converted to storage or forgotten entirely. Electricity was first. Municipal power grids, which had been unreliable and limited in geographic reach during the 1890s, had become robust, redundant, and cheap by the 1940s. Consolidated Edison in New York and Commonwealth Edison in Chicago were massive utilities capable of delivering power at a cost per kilowatt hour that no private hotel plant could approach. The economics were implacable. A utility generating power for millions of customers spread its fixed costs across an enormous base. A hotel generating power for one building bore those costs alone. One by one, hotels disconnected their generators and plugged into the public grid. The dynamos that had been the beating heart of the basement fell silent. The coal bunkers emptied. The stokers, the men who had shoveled fuel into furnaces in the deepest part of the building, were dismissed. Refrigeration followed a similar arc. Industrial ice plants and mechanical refrigeration units had spread throughout the food industry by mid-century, and commercial cold storage was available from companies that could deliver ice or refrigerated space at competitive prices. The massive ammonia compressors in hotel basements, which were dangerous to operate and expensive to maintain, were replaced by smaller, safer commercial units. The ice manufacturing plants that had once produced 150 tons daily were shut down. Ice arrived on trucks from outside suppliers who could produce it in bulk at a fraction of the cost. The laundry was the most painful transition because laundry had been the single largest employer in most hotel basements. Hundreds of workers had operated the washing machines, the mangles, the presses, the folding stations, and the delivery systems that kept thousands of rooms supplied with fresh linens daily. By 1950, commercial laundry services had grown from small operations into industrial enterprises equipped with machinery that dwarfed anything a hotel basement could hold. A commercial laundry could wash, press, fold, and deliver a hotel's entire daily linen supply in less time, at lower total cost, and with fewer workers than the hotel's own operation required. The math was inescapable. Hotels began outsourcing their laundry, first in part, then entirely. Each service that migrated out of the basement left behind empty rooms and idle machinery. What had been a bustling laundry became a storage area for old furniture. What had been a boiler room became a mechanical closet housing modern HVAC equipment. What had been a vast kitchen complex serving 5,000 meals became a smaller operation feeding a reduced guest count from a reduced menu. The underground city did not collapse all at once. It thinned, it contracted, it grew quiet, one department at a time, one engine at a time, like a city losing population block by block until the streets are empty and the lights go out. The New Yorker's power plant was the most notable holdout. It continued generating electricity for the building until 1967, more than 3 decades after most comparable hotel plants had been decommissioned. The plant was so well engineered, so efficiently designed, that it remained cost competitive with grid power long beyond what anyone had anticipated. Its engineers maintained it with pride, understanding that they were operating a piece of engineering history. But even the New Yorker could not hold out against the economics of scale forever. A single building, no matter how large, could not generate electricity as cheaply as a utility serving millions of customers across an entire metropolitan area. Meanwhile, outside the cities, a revolution in American travel was rendering the entire debate about basements irrelevant. The motel was rising. Born on the highways that were proliferating across the American landscape in the post-war era, the motel was everything the Grand Hotel was not. It was horizontal instead of vertical. It had no basement. It had no hidden workforce. It had no power plant, no laundry, no kitchen complex, no engineering department with rotating shifts. A guest pulled into a parking lot, walked 10 feet to a door, and found a clean bed, a functioning bathroom, and a television. The comfort was modest. The infrastructure was minimal. The price was a fraction of what a Grand Hotel charged. And Americans, increasingly mobile and increasingly interested in convenience over grandeur, flocked to motels by the millions. The motel did not kill the Grand Hotel, but it created an alternative that revealed, by contrast, how much of the Grand Hotel's cost structure was devoted not to the guest's comfort, but to the maintenance of the hidden world beneath the lobby. A motel proved that Americans would accept a simpler version of comfort if it was convenient and affordable. And that proof undermined the fundamental argument for the basement, that luxury required an invisible industrial city to produce it. The motel said that luxury was optional, comfort was not, and comfort did not need a power plant. The basement had been built on 3 pillars: captive labor, unreliable municipal services, and high demand. By 1960, all 3 pillars had cracked. The labor was organized and expensive. The municipal services were robust and cheap. And the demand had been fractured by a new model of hospitality that needed no basement at all. The machines had made themselves obsolete. and the world they had created beneath the floor was disappearing, one silent engine at a time. Chapter 9. The last engine shuts down. Sometime in 1967, an engineer at the New Yorker hotel flipped a switch, and the largest private power plant in America went dark for the final time. No ceremony marked the moment. No press release was issued. No photograph was taken. The plant that had generated enough electricity for 35,000 people, the plant that the IEEE would later recognize as a milestone in electrical engineering, simply stopped. The boilers cooled from their operating temperature for the first time in 37 years. The turbines wound down, their rotational speed decreasing from thousands of revolutions per minute to 0 over the course of an hour. The generators stopped producing current. The Frankenstein board, 60 feet of switches and gauges that had controlled every electrical circuit in a 42-story building, fell dark. The indicator lamps went out, one by one, like stars disappearing before dawn. The New Yorker connected to Consolidated Edison's grid that year. The power that had once been manufactured 80 feet below the lobby, in rooms where the heat was so intense that engineers worked in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees, now arrived through cables from the street. It was indistinguishable from the power serving the apartment building next door and the deli across the avenue. The electricity was the same. The light it produced was the same. The hotel's utility bill went up somewhat. Its maintenance costs went down dramatically. And the team of engineers who had operated the plant around the clock, in rotating shifts, monitoring the Frankenstein board through night shifts and holidays and blizzards and heat waves for 37 consecutive years, were no longer needed. No one threw them a party. No one wrote about them in the newspapers. The engineers of the New Yorker's power plant slipped out of history as quietly as they had worked inside it. Across the country, similar endings were playing out in silence. The Stevens Hotel, reborn as the Conrad Hilton, had already stripped its basement of most industrial functions. Its room count had been halved. Its candy factory was a memory. Its hospital was closed. Its ice cream plant was disassembled. Its 18-hole miniature golf course had been repurposed. Where Ernest Stevens had built an underground city employing thousands, Conrad Hilton operated a streamlined business that purchased its services from outside vendors and maintained a basement that was mostly used for storage. The original Waldorf, the one George Bolt had opened in 1893 with 970 servants, and that enormous electrical plant 42 feet below the sidewalk, was already gone. It had been demolished in 1929 to make way for the Empire State Building. The basement that had pioneered the concept of the underground hotel city, the place where the entire model was invented, was crushed and buried beneath the foundation of the tallest building in the world. There is a precision to that image. The Waldorf's basement, the prototype, was not abandoned or converted or forgotten. It was obliterated, its physical space consumed by a structure that represented a different kind of ambition entirely. The New Yorker's story took a stranger turn. In 1976, the Unification Church, led by Sun Myung Moon, purchased the hotel. The building that had once represented the pinnacle of American luxury and engineering ambition became the headquarters of a religious organization. The rooms that had hosted dignitaries and debutantes and captains of industry were converted to offices and residences for church members. The basement, with its dormant power plant and its 60-foot switchboard and its sealed Art Deco tunnel, became a historical curiosity known only to a handful of building engineers and urban explorers who wrote about it on the early internet. The Palmer House endured, but it too shed its underground identity. The basement that had produced brownies for the world's Columbian Exposition and laundered linens for Chicago's elite was reduced, reconfigured, and partly forgotten. The lobby fresco, that protest of romance against the everydayness of life, still looked down on guests who had no idea what had once existed below their feet. The Book Cadillac in Detroit, once another monument to the basement model, closed entirely in 1984 and sat empty for over 2 decades before being renovated into a modern hotel with none of its original underground infrastructure intact. The end of the basement era was not dramatic. It was not a collapse. It was a fade. The motors stopped one at a time, across decades, in basements scattered across a dozen cities. The laundries emptied. The kitchens contracted. The engineering crews were reduced to skeleton staffs responsible for maintaining purchased utilities rather than generating power from raw fuel. The boilers that had once burned coal around the clock were replaced by heat exchangers connected to city steam mains. The ice plants were replaced by commercial freezers plugged into wall outlets. The printing presses were replaced by orders to outside vendors. And the guests above, who had never known what was beneath them, never noticed it was gone. That final detail is perhaps the most revealing of all. The system of concealment had worked so well that its own disappearance was invisible. The guests never saw the underground city when it was running. They did not see it when it died. The architecture of invisibility, designed to hide labor from the people who consumed its products, ultimately hid the death of the system itself. The silence in the basement was the sound of an entire economic model expiring. Not with a crash, but with the click of a switch and the slow unwinding of a turbine, spinning down to nothing, 80 feet below the sidewalk, in the dark. Chapter 10: Ghosts in the Switchboard. The 60-foot switchboard still sits in the New Yorker's basement, its labels for the ice rink and coffee shop lights still legible, controlling nothing. What survives is not a ruin in the romantic sense. There are no crumbling walls covered in ivy, no picturesque decay that invites contemplation from a comfortable distance. What survives is industrial equipment in various states of preservation, sitting in rooms that most people in the building above have never entered and do not know exist. It is a strange kind of archaeology. The artifacts are not ancient. They are 20th century. Some still have manufacturer's labels. Some still have oil in their reservoirs. All of them are forgotten. Joe Kinney, a building engineer with a passion for history, has documented much of what remains inside the New Yorker. His collection exceeds 4,000 historical photographs, painstakingly assembled over years of access to parts of the building that are closed to the public. Kinney has cataloged the machinery, the layouts, the labels, the architectural details that reveal the building's original purpose. His photographs show the Frankenstein board in its current state, its rows of switches frozen in their last positions, its gauges reading 0, its labels still legible after decades of disuse. Ice rink, coffee shop, guest floors, service elevators, ballroom, kitchen, laundry. Each label names a circuit. Each circuit once powered a piece of the underground city. Now they are names on a dead board, a directory for a world that no longer exists. The Art Deco tunnel to Penn Station is sealed. Its decorative tile work, the same geometric patterns and glazed surfaces that adorned the lobby above, lines a passageway that no one walks. The tunnel that once allowed guests to stroll from train platform to hotel lobby without stepping outside, that once served as a supply artery connecting the hotel's basement to the national rail network, is a dead end. Somewhere behind the sealed doors, the tiles gather dust in darkness. The tunnel is not crumbling. It is simply closed, a perfectly preserved corridor leading from somewhere to nowhere, beautiful and pointless, like a sentence in a language no one speaks. At the Plaza, the legacy is more accessible. The original coal chutes, the iron plates that once covered sidewalk openings where tons of fuel were dumped into the basement by grimy delivery workers, are still partially visible. In the hotel's lower levels, now occupied by a fitness center and spa, guests exercise alongside exposed subway tile and structural elements that were part of the original service infrastructure. The coal dust is long gone. The boilers are silent, but the bones of the hidden city are embedded in the walls. If you know what you are looking at, if you understand the building's history, you can read the original blueprint in every exposed beam and tiled corridor. The fitness center is built inside the body of the old machine. The Palmer House lobby ceiling, with its painted clouds and gilded figures and allegorical scenes, remains one of the most photographed hotel interiors in America. The fresco was described by a writer whose name has been largely forgotten as a protest of romance against the everydayness of life. But the everydayness it was protesting against was not merely the street outside or the ordinary world of work and commerce. It was the basement directly below. The painted sky was a ceiling above a ceiling, beauty layered over machinery, art deployed to ensure that the guest's gaze was directed upward, always upward, toward heaven and romance and gold leaf, away from the truth beneath the floor, where workers shoveled coal and pressed sheets and scrubbed pots in the heat and the dark. These are not ruins. They are artifacts of a system so thoroughly erased that most people walking above them have no idea they exist. The switchboard controls nothing. The tunnel leads nowhere. The coal chutes feed empty space. But they are still there, embedded in the structure of buildings that have been renovated and repurposed and sold and resold, waiting for someone to ask what they were and what it meant that they were hidden. Chapter 11. $2 billion to erase the basement. When the Waldorf-Astoria reopened in 2025 after an 8-year, $2 billion renovation, its basement had been transformed into a spa. The number is worth sitting with. $2 billion. That is what it cost to convert a grand hotel from the old model to the new one. The renovation stripped the Waldorf to its structural skeleton and rebuilt it as a mixed-use property. Hotel rooms, private residences, and modern amenities occupying spaces where industrial machinery had once stood. The basement that had once generated enough electricity for a small city, that had produced 150 tons of ice daily, that had employed hundreds of workers in conditions that prompted strikes and investigations, was remade into a wellness center where guests pay several $100s for the privilege of relaxation in temperature-controlled water. Where engineers once shoveled coal, guests now float in saltwater pools. Where stokers once burned fuel to power turbines, estheticians now apply facial treatments. The transformation is so complete that a visitor to the spa would need to be told explicitly what the space once was. The architecture of erasure has done its work. Across the industry, similar transformations have been underway for decades, each one quieter and less expensive than the Waldorf's, but serving the same purpose. Laundries have become meeting rooms. Boiler rooms have become fitness centers. Coal chutes have become historical curiosities, mentioned on guided tours as charming architectural details, evidence of a quaint and distant past, rather than the infrastructure of a labor system that operated within living memory. Each conversion is another layer of forgetting. Each renovation is another step in the process of erasing the industrial reality that once defined the building from the inside out. The Plaza's basement has undergone the most dramatic sequence of reinventions. It has been, at various times, a grill room where businessmen dined beneath low ceilings, a supper club with live entertainment, a cinema, a spa, and a luxury retail mall. Each incarnation replaced the previous one completely. A guest visiting the Plaza's underground spaces today encounters high-end shops, polished stone, curated lighting, and the careful silence of expensive retail. Nothing in the environment suggests that this space once housed coal bunkers, boiler rooms, and laundry facilities operated by workers who entered through service doors and were forbidden from using the guest elevators. The coal has been replaced by cashmere. The boilers have been replaced by boutiques. The economics of the modern hotel confirm how completely the old model has vanished. Labor now represents roughly 50% of laundry costs for hotels that still operate their own facilities. Minimum wages in major American cities exceed $15 an hour, a sum that would have been unimaginable to the strikers of 1912, who were fighting for the right to earn a predictable wage at all. Approximately 80% of hotels still perform some laundry in-house, but none maintains the comprehensive underground infrastructure of the old model. The laundry room in a modern hotel is a room. It is not a factory. It has commercial machines, not industrial equipment. It has a few employees, not a few hundred. The kitchen is a kitchen, not a food production complex with its own butcher shop, bakery, candy factory, and ice cream plant. The engineering department maintains purchased utilities. It does not generate power from raw fuel. The $2 billion spent on the Waldorf renovation purchased many things: updated guest rooms, modern building systems, luxury finishes. Private residences sold at prices that would have funded the construction of the original hotel several times over. But what the money really purchased was erasure. The physical evidence of the old world, the world of basements and hidden labor, and private power plants and 60-foot switchboards, was removed, covered over, redesigned, and replaced with something that tells a different story. A story of wellness rather than work, of relaxation rather than production, of choice rather than necessity. The new Waldorf is beautiful, it is comfortable, it is expensive, and it contains no trace of the 970 servants who once worked beneath it in darkness, or the power plant that once rivaled a small city's grid, or the ice machines that once produced 150 tons of cold every day, or the laundry that once processed thousands of pounds of linen before dawn, or the kitchen that once fed 5,000 people from a basement that no guest was ever meant to see. The renovation did not merely update the building, it erased the argument that the building had once embodied. The argument that luxury requires a hidden industrial city, staffed by invisible workers, operating beneath the guests' feet, is gone. The spa is where the boilers used to be. The boutiques are where the coal bunkers used to be, and the guests, floating in warm water in rooms where engineers once shoveled fuel in 120-degree heat, will never know what came before them. That is the final act of the architecture of concealment. It conceals its own history. Chapter 12. The Price of Not Seeing. The Grand Hotel did not die because Americans stopped wanting comfort. It died because the people who manufactured that comfort refused to remain invisible. That sentence contains the entire story. Every chapter in this documentary, every boiler room and switchboard and laundry and strike and bankruptcy leads to this single conclusion. The system was not destroyed by technology, although technology enabled its replacement. It was not destroyed by economics, although economics accelerated its collapse. It was destroyed by visibility. When the workers who operated the hidden city demanded to be seen, when they walked out of the service corridors and onto the sidewalks and into the newspapers, and finally into a union hall where they signed a contract that said their names and their labor mattered, the product itself changed. Because the product was never really comfort. The product was the right not to see the labor that produced comfort. Consider what the Grand Hotel actually sold. A guest checking into the Waldorf in 1910 was not merely paying for a room, a meal, and a pressed suit delivered to the door. The guest was paying for a world in which rooms were clean without cleaners being visible. Meals appeared without kitchens being audible. Suits were pressed without laundry workers being present. Electricity flowed without generators being heard, and ice appeared without machinery being seen. The guest was paying for the experience of effortlessness, and effortlessness requires, by definition, that effort be concealed. The moment effort becomes visible, effortlessness dies. When the workers struck in 1912, they did not merely demand better wages and shorter hours. They demanded to be present in the guest's awareness. They stepped out of the hidden corridors and onto the public sidewalk. They stood in front of the same doors they had been forbidden to enter. They became visible. And the moment they became visible, the product the hotel was selling, the illusion that comfort was natural and effortless and free of human cost, was compromised. This is why the hotel owners fought so hard against unionization for 26 years. It was not simply that unions raised costs, although they did. It was not simply that unions reduced management's flexibility, although they did. It was that unions made labor permanent, visible, and acknowledged. A union contract is a document that says, plainly in writing, enforceable by law, these people exist. They do this work. They are paid this amount. They work these hours. You must acknowledge them. The Grand Hotel's entire architecture, from the dual corridors to the service elevators to the coal chutes hidden behind iron plates, was designed to say the opposite. These people do not exist. This work does not happen. Your comfort simply is. The philosophical question this story raises extends far beyond the hotel industry, beyond the specific history of basements and boilers and switchboards. Every system of luxury depends on hidden labor. The Grand Hotel merely made the hiding literal. It built the concealment into the architecture. It designed corridors specifically so that workers could not be seen. It buried the factories beneath the lobby. It created a physical, three-dimensional, architecturally precise manifestation of the principle that comfort is most complete when its production is most invisible. That principle has not disappeared. It has migrated. The underground cities beneath the Grand Hotels are gone, their machinery scrapped, their rooms converted, their workers long since retired or dead. But the economic logic that built them persists in forms that would be instantly recognizable to George Bolt and Ernest Stevens and the engineers who operated the Frankenstein board. Modern luxury still depends on workers who are not seen by the people they serve. Hotel housekeepers today work in conditions that the strikers of 1912 would recognize. They are assigned more rooms than they can comfortably clean in a shift. They work alone. They are expected to be finished before the guest returns. They are expected to be invisible. The architecture of concealment has changed. Instead of hidden corridors, there are scheduling systems that ensure housekeepers arrive when guests are absent and depart before guests return. The principle is identical. The method is different. The result is the same. Warehouse workers filling orders for overnight delivery operate in buildings that most consumers will never see, in locations chosen specifically for their distance from residential neighborhoods. Gig economy drivers deliver meals from restaurants to doorsteps, appearing briefly as a notification on a phone screen and then vanishing. Agricultural workers harvest the food that appears, washed and packaged, in grocery stores designed to look like gardens rather than the endpoints of industrial supply chains. The labor is real, the effort is enormous, and the system is designed, engineered, and optimized so that the consumer experiences only the result, never the cause. The Grand Hotel basement was a parable. It said, "This is what happens when a society decides that comfort requires someone else's invisibility. For a time, the system works. The basements hum, the motors turn, the guests are satisfied, the ice appears, the sheets are clean, the lights stay on, the effort is hidden. But eventually, the people in the basement realize that they are people. They organize, they strike, they demand a contract, they demand to be seen, and the system, which was built on the assumption that they would remain hidden forever, discovers that it cannot survive their visibility. Because the product it was selling was not comfort. It was the absence of awareness. And once awareness arrives, it does not leave. 80 feet below the lobby of the New Yorker Hotel, the Frankenstein board sits in darkness. Its 60 feet of switches and gauges control nothing. Its labels for the ice rink and the coffee shop and the guest room lights name circuits that no longer carry current and rooms that no longer draw power from the basement. The plant that once generated enough electricity for 35,000 people is cold and still. The Art Deco tunnel to Penn Station is sealed behind locked doors. The ammonia compressors are gone. The coal bunkers are empty. The laundry is silent. Above, in the lobby and the corridors and the rooms, thousands of guests will sleep tonight. Their sheets were laundered somewhere they will never see, by workers whose names they will never know. Their food was prepared in kitchens they will never enter. Their electricity was generated at a power plant they will never visit. The comfort is real. The invisibility is real. And the distance between the two, the distance that separates the experience of ease from the labor that produces it, is the same distance it has always been. The motors are silent now, but the system they powered, the system of hidden work and visible comfort, the system that says you